So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us at this seminar at this time today. So today, Professor Ratnesh Shukla from Indian Institute of Science will be presenting. He's currently a visiting Erskine Fellow at University of Canterbury and has interest in fluid mechanics in different broad areas. Today, he will be talking about simulations of collective bubble growth and collapse dynamics. So thank you, Ratnesh, for presenting at this seminar series, and we're all ears to hear more about this interesting talk.
Thank you, Azadeh, and thanks for having me here present this work. So this work is about bubble growth and collapse dynamics, and this is a topic that has attracted significant attention because of its relevance to underwater hydraulic machinery. By the way, if you have any questions, please do feel free to interrupt. That would be a good way of knowing that I'm online also. So yeah, that I would encourage that. So coming back here, whenever we have something like a propelling device that is in an underwater scenario, you would get this helical train of bubbles behind its wake, starting from the tip of this propeller, and these cavitation bubbles that are formed because of the cavitation inception events that take place on the propeller tip are known to lead to structural damage. So if we look at a typical turbine operation over some time, what we find is that starting from something that is brand new, over 2 years of operation, you would start to see significant structural damage. So there's been a lot of interest in quantifying how bubbles cause damage. So this video here shows a typical collapse event. I'll just play it again. So, oops. So here you can see that there's a bubble that is generated out of spark here and this bubble, because of energy deposition, this bubble initially grows and then collapses and then forms a jet, and that jet goes and impinges on this surface here. So this jet impingement has been investigated quite a bit because it's typically very high-speed jet. So if we are looking at bubbles that are of size of millimeters, typically these jet speeds can be as high as 1,000 meters per second. And the collapse is quite aspherical. And as you can see from some of these earlier investigations, there was a lot of interest in figuring out the characteristics of the jet as a function of the standoff distance, which is the distance that separates this bubble from a solid surface, basically. So there's a lot of benign applications also that people have looked at. So because this is a highly intense and violent process, one can actuate flows at microscale. So here you can see in this particular study, bubble growth and collapse have been looked at in confined geometries. So if you have something like this, you get a collapse in this direction. If you have a geometry of this sort, and because it's intense, you can actuate flows at small scales very rapidly. So in technology, there's a huge bunch of application areas that have essentially talked about using bubble collapse dynamics to their advantage. So obviously, structural damage is something that we do not want, but there's interest in quantification, so avoided. I hope I'm audible. Just hope you can hear me still. Yeah.
Yes, we can. Sorry, I was on mute.
Sorry, I think I got some notification because of which I...
No, it's all good. We can hear you.
Yeah, okay, sure. So yeah, coming back to the slides, there's interest from an acoustic detection point of view. So if you have an underwater scenario, let's just say, and there's pipe leaks, then these bubbles tend to collapse very rapidly. They emit out shock waves, blast waves in the process, and these waves are basically acoustic waves at long distances and can be detected. So therefore, well, if you think of an inverse situation, one can figure out if there's a lot of acoustic disturbance, then that can be a way of figuring out whether there has been a leak or not. And the collapse process is quite intense. So when the medium is right and the conditions are favorable, one can get light emission, which is sonoluminescence. The jetting can be used to clean surfaces, and there's also detonation that can take place in energetic materials through a similar bubble collapse like phenomenon. So in an energetic material, you essentially have voids, and as these voids collapse, they lead to intense hotspots, which eventually lead to detonation. So a lot of technological applications, and I think the more one investigates, the more one finds. And there's evidence of cavitation in nature as well. So both in plant kingdom and animal kingdom, you can find that cavitation plays an important role. So one specific finding that I'll just demonstrate here through this animation is that of a snapping shrimp, which brings its claws together very rapidly, and that causes a cavitation bubble to form. As it collapses, the jet produced by this collapse process and the waves stun the prey. So in this particular case, basically jetting and the collapse process is used to stun the prey. And every time we crack our knuckles, it's basically a cavitation event that produces the sound that we hear. So our interest in cavitation is coming more from a biomedical perspective. So there's a technique, lithotripsy, that you might be quite familiar with. It's used to treat kidney stones, wherein the idea is that if you have kidney stones, then you impinge these stones with ultrasonic waves, and those ultrasound waves would tend to disintegrate the kidney stone, and then once the kidney stone is small enough, it would pass out from the body. But what really happens in practice is that there's tissue damage that accompanies the treatment process. So one hypothesis is that these ultrasound waves would cause local tearing of blood, and once these cavitation inception events take place, the bubbles cause damage to surrounding tissue while disintegrating the stone. So the idea is to optimize and hopefully avoid such widespread tissue damage. In techniques more recently proposed, like histotripsy and high-intensity focused ultrasound wave-based treatments, the idea is to use the destructive power of these bubbles to actually destroy unwanted cells such as tumors, basically. Right, and then there's evidence of cavitation playing an important role in traumatic brain injury, wherein if you think of these sports such as rugby, football, you have these events when strong pressure waves are sent through brain, and these can cause cavitation like events where you have cavitation bubbles formed, and these bubbles would basically cause damage to the tissue in long term, right? So in all these scenarios, unlike what we expect in water, we have basically a strong role of viscosity that one can anticipate. There's elasticity of the tissue that obviously must play an important role, but there's also a non-Newtonian rheology that must be important. So unlike water, tissues would exhibit these strain rate dependent viscosity changes, and much of our current activity is driven by a need to understand how these strain rate dependent rheology affects cavitation, essentially. So this is going to be our overarching goal, and this is what we have been doing. and the talk essentially focuses around this central idea. So there's been quite a bit of work on cavitation. It's an old topic, but what both from a simulations and from an experimental perspective, the focus has mostly been on what is referred to as an inertial collapse, where you essentially look at jetting and shock wave characteristics as this bubble collapses and jets. And in these inertial scenarios, viscosity plays a minimal role, basically. So you have this jet formation, and then the characteristics of the jet are more or less inertial. As the jet disintegrates and breaks up, obviously there's effect of viscosity and surface tension and so on, but not so much while the jetting process itself takes place. Whereas now, if we start thinking about tissues in general and fluids that might be much more viscous, it's both viscoelastic and so the viscoelastic response is quite important there, right? And while there's a substantial body of work that has been done to analyze spherical bubble dynamics in such fluids, there's much more that has to be done when it comes to jetting characteristics. So what I mean by spherical bubble dynamics is basically if you have something like a spherical bubble sitting in a non-Newtonian or viscoelastic fluid, then one can analyze its spherical response by looking at a generalization of a Rayleigh-Plesset-like equation, which is a well-known equation in this area. And then the radius simply undergoes a time-based response that is illustrated here. So you can think if you have a pressure difference applied to the bubble, it will grow and collapse. But throughout this collapse and growth process, aspherical effects are completely ignored. So much of the work has gone on into analyzing the effect of viscosity, or rather viscoelasticity, on how this growth and collapse pattern changes, but not so much on the asphericity or the jetting dynamics, basically. So a principal goal that we have in our group is to investigate these aspherical effects in a setup that is not as constrained as this radial dynamics, and then find the dependencies of these jetting instability on rheological parameters, basically. And so we work on simulations, and one of the model options that one can go for and is quite attractive is to have a fully compressible multifluid formulation for such collapse dynamics. So you account for non-Newtonian rheology or in general viscoelasticity, and then look for what the bubble does when it sees these pressure differences. And such treatments are actually quite attractive because they are general, and they can account for shocks, complex topological changes which the bubble undergoes, and complications of equation of state as well. So we have actually, in fact, while some of the groups that have contributed to this development of these kind of models have been mentioned here, we have also contributed to such models significantly. And one of the disadvantages of such models is that they are actually inherently designed to account for shock wave and wave transmissions across these interfaces that separate widely differing materials. So what I mean by that is that on one hand, you have a bubble which has a much lower acoustic impedance compared to a material like water or tissue, where the acoustic impedance is significantly larger. So it's a big challenge to be able to model accurate shock transmission across these interfaces. And much work has gone on into being able to do that. But the tools that are available to do these accurate shock wave transmissions are typically inefficient and inaccurate for weak shocks or acoustic perturbations. And that is just because of the way in which artificial viscosity or numerical dissipation is added to stabilize such methods. And then the resolution of these sharp flow features, thin boundary layers, and taking constitutive relationship Newtonian or even a non-Newtonian viscosity becomes very challenging. So our interest here has been primarily focused on ensuring that we can account for complex constitutive relationship across the interfaces. So the bubble is going to see a medium that has a complex rheological signature, and therefore one must be able to account for this rheology. And also looking at interfacial boundary conditions. So here, when we look at microcavitation in events, which are what should be the primary focus when one looks at these biomedical applications, then it's not really the accurate wave transmission or shock wave transmission that governs the dynamics of the bubble, but it's more to do with Rayleigh Taylor-like instabilities which set in when a bubble accelerates, basically, when the interface of the bubble accelerates. So the key challenge that we must overcome are, of course, the constitutive relationship complexity, the interfacial boundary conditions, which means that we must accurately account for pressure differences and the fact that stresses are continuous across the interface, because this will play an important role in the instability evolution. And also the fact that multiple growth cycles and growth and collapse cycles should be accounted for. So this is something which is very challenging if one pursues a diffuse interface treatment within the compressible fluid formulation. And shown here is, for instance, a collapse and a growth cycle. So a bubble starts off with an initial radius, and because it's perturbed through a pressure gradient, it starts to shrink in size and then again grows back. But as you can see, these different formulations tend to give you different results, and it's really hard to come up with formulations that follow this growth and collapse cycle exactly if one works with compressible formulation. So what we have done is we have used a long wavelength approximation. So we say that when a bubble in an acoustic field sees pressure perturbations, and its size is small, like in a microcavitation event, then it's almost as if the wavelength of these pressure perturbations is infinite, which essentially means that an incompressibility condition can be used for the surrounding medium. So if you think about it, these bubbles tend to collapse and emit out shock waves, but these waves are strong really when for the bubble, but for a medium which is stiff, like a tissue or water, these waves are essentially acoustic waves, and therefore it's good enough to treat the surrounding medium as an incompressible fluid, but could have a complex rheology like a generalized Newtonian fluid, which is what I'm going to focus in this talk. And then the gas itself is such that it's all the effect of it undergoing a collapse and jetting is to constrain the medium through a pressure, basically. So what I mean by that is typically the viscosity of the gas would be significantly smaller than the viscosity of the surrounding medium, and therefore its contents can be assumed to be inviscid. And one can also then apply a homogeneous bubble approximation, which essentially means that the density and the pressure of this bubble would be such that it's almost uniform compared to the changes that the fluid would see. Right. So these are the typical approximations that go into the Rayleigh-Plesset model as well. But the main difference between this Rayleigh-Plesset model and the one that we have here is that we allow for aspherical bubble dynamics, which means that we can account for jetting collapse. Whereas if you go for a typical theoretical Rayleigh-Plesset model like treatment, you would only have radial pulsations that are allowed for the bubble. Okay, so with this approximation at hand, what we have done is looked at an incompressible flow solver, which is fairly easy to implement for the surrounding fluid. We have had years of development of such solvers. We use a staggered mesh projection approach. And for the interface, we use, again, a well-established narrowband level set method. But in this particular case, this method does not suffer from mass conservation errors. That is because of the way we are treating the bubble dynamics, basically. So because any change in the pressure that this bubble sees is it ultimately connected to its density and therefore its overall mass. And we pay special attention to the interfacial boundary conditions. So our treatment of the interface is sharp, and to enforce the interfacial boundary conditions, which means like we should have the correct pressure jump and stress-free conditions across the interface, we first identify intersections of the mesh lines with the zero level set of the sign distance function, and then using these intersections, we identify the nodes at which we must apply an appropriate higher order boundary condition. So the basic idea is to have an interface and then figure out cells which are used for solving for the velocity and the pressure fields. And in those cells, use a ghost fluid-like approach where you essentially fill up data points needed for these cells using a higher order constrained extrapolation, which takes into account the appropriate pressure and shear free condition. Right, and because it's a level set method, one also needs to advect this level set. So typically, one needs information on cells which go beyond just the ghost cells that you saw earlier in this slide. So one needs to fill up data points everywhere wherever the level set must be advected. So what we do is essentially apply this process that I very briefly described here to as many nodes as necessary. Right, so that's just a brief overview of what we do from a solver perspective, and I'm just going to quickly show some demonstration cases. So with this particular solver at hand, we have looked at what is basically an impulse response. So if you have a bubble that's simply pulsating in a liquid medium, because of an initial pressure difference, you would see that the bubble radius would initially rise and then fall, and then these growth and collapse cycles will continue and over time be damped. So the solid line here shows the predictions from the Rayleigh-Plesset equation, which is like a semi-analytical approach, and our axisymmetric simulations are pretty much on top of it. One can also do something like a forced oscillation, so where you initially have a bubble at equilibrium, and then there's a sinusoidal pressure perturbation applied on this bubble. So as this perturbation is applied, the bubble grows and undergoes collapse, and the characteristics of the perturbation determine what kind of growth and collapse cycles the bubble will see. So this particular example is what is referred to as a giant collapse regime, where because the bubble is driven close to its resonance frequency, it undergoes significant size change. So you can see at this lowest point, the bubble would look somewhat like this, shown in blue, whereas at this maximum size, the bubble grows up to a big size of this form. So again, the predictions from our simulations are pretty much on top of what is predicted from the Rayleigh-Plesset equation. And you can see at its lowest size, we use about 14 points for resolving this entire bubble, which is quite good. I would also emphasize here that the honest arch number, which is a measure of how important the viscous and surface tension forces are, is of the order of 1, which means that we are accurately treating not just the viscous effects, but also the surface tension effects. So one can do three-dimensional calculations as well. So this is also something we have done. So if we, again, drive the bubble at certain frequency and pressure perturbation, one can observe that in 3 dimensions also we get growth and collapse cycle characteristics, which are well predicted from our numerical simulations. So here you are seeing how the radius of the bubble varies in time as it is perturbed by this sinusoidal pressure gradient. And what you're also seeing is asphericity, which is a measure of how much this bubble deviates from a purely spherical size. So these are not axisymmetric calculations, but they are rather three-dimensional. So one can figure out how much of a deviation one observes in simulating these this bubble dynamics by simply looking at how much the mean radius deviates from how much the actual bubble radius deviates from a mean spherical radius. So plotted in log scale, the sphericity looks somewhat like this. So it's small compared to the overall size here, but it's not zero. So the animation that I'm just going to show here hopefully gives an idea of what the bubble undergoes. So as you can see, as a pressure gradient is applied, the bubble grows and collapses in multiple cycles. And there's a small deviation from a spherical shape that you can see, especially when the bubble is at its smallest size. So we have done quite a few calculations of this kind based on the frequency that is applied and the pressure perturbation that the bubble sees. Different oscillation patterns can be observed. So it's not like asphericity is never important. So there are cases in which we have seen that but the bubble continues to undergo oscillations of this form, which again match quite well with what is predicted from Rayleigh-Plesset equation. But the asphericity, on the other hand, continues to rise. So in this particular case, the viscosity of the medium is low, and the frequency is such that it promotes this aspherical, the growth of aspherical modes. Okay, so if you look at what the bubble does, it looks somewhat like this. So again, to start off, there's oscillations which look radial, and then gradually there are these aspherical modes that start to grow, and then the bubble eventually disintegrates. So we can do complex simulations of this form, and we can also do simulations of primary interest here. So remember, what we really want to look at is aspherical bubble growth and collapse dynamics, and that is important because the damage that these bubbles cause because of jetting is a primary source of our interest here. So we have looked at configurations in which there's a bubble that sits next to a wall. Okay, so what I'm going to show here now to you is a three-dimensional calculation in which a bubble is placed at an initial higher pressure compared to the ambient. So a pressure ratio of 10, which means that if you think of atmospheric pressure for the ambient, you have a bubble here which is at an initial pressure of 10 times the atmospheric pressure, and it grows and then eventually collapses. And the primary interest is in looking at what happens to the bubble jet and what happens to the wall pressures. Okay, so these are some of the parameters for this this particular simulation. All right, and it corresponds to basically a 4 micron air bubble that sits in water. All right, so shown here is an animation in which what you're seeing is pressure contours on this plane, and the bubble is shown through this isosurface. So as the bubble grows and collapses, there's a jet formation. This jet goes and hits this surface, and that leads to high pressures that are shown in red. Okay, and the lower pressures are shown in blue, basically. So this is a pretty expensive calculation. And for this particular three-dimensional calculation, we have used AMR with 6 levels of refinement, which gives us an effective resolution of about 136 points across the initial bubble radius. So we can do even larger calculations, and the basic idea behind showing these is that this is not something that would be easily doable with a fully compressible flow model, okay, taking into account viscosity and surface tension effects as well. So typically, these bubbles would occur in clusters. There's rarely, except in controlled experimental scenarios, there's rarely occurrence of a single bubble. So bubble clusters and their collapse characteristics are of significant interest. And what I'm showing to you is collapse of a 50 bubble cluster here. And this is a pretty expensive calculation and has been possible only because we can do parallel computation over this many cores, basically. So the effective resolution in this particular case would be about 90 points across the initial mean bubble radius. And like in the previous case, the contours here show the pressure levels. So blue means lower pressure, whereas red indicates higher pressure. And out here, you're seeing a footprint of this mesh somewhere along the midplane. So compared to the single bubble case, you can see that these bubbles tend to collapse towards the center. And as the collapse, the high pressure is seen in the localized regions, basically. Okay. So with this treatment in place and confidence in our capabilities of being able to simulate single and multiple bubble cluster collapse events, we have gone on and looked at a single bubble collapse next to a wall, but in a case where the surrounding fluid is governed by a generalized Newtonian behavior. So our main focus has been on being able to characterize these collapse and jetting characteristics when the surrounding medium has a complex rheological signature. And for these calculations, an axisymmetric setup is good enough because we are primarily interested in the jetting characteristics. So if you recall from previous animations, jetting is predominantly axisymmetric. And once the jet hits and forms and impacts this wall, three-dimensional effects are obviously of importance, but to figure out whether the jet forms or not, it's good enough to do axisymmetric calculations as well by itself. So what I'm going to show you now is growth and collapse characteristics of the bubble in a setup like this, where we have an initial bubble that is placed at this standoff of H naught, okay, and its initial pressure is set to a value that is higher than the ambient. So this essentially models something like a bubble formation event where you have high energy that is localized and put into the fluid, okay, similar to a cavitation inception event, and then as a result, the bubble grows and then collapses and there's jet formation. So the key difference between what if you look through the literature and between what people have done before and what I'm presenting here is the rheological signature. So we are interested in looking at what shear thinning or shear thickening rheology does to this collapse characteristics. How does it modify it? And for that, we have put in a very simple constitutive relationship of the form shown here. So in here, we have a generalized Newtonian rheology that is prescribed, and that is dependent on obviously the local strain rate. So as the strain rate when it's zero, you can see you get something like a zero strain rate viscosity. When the strain rate is infinitely high or much higher compared to 1 over this material time scale, you get a viscosity which is mu infinity. So between these two limiting cases, the viscosity undergoes a transition, and one can come up with these key non-dimensional parameters, which are the effective viscosity scaled with these primary characteristics. So initial bubble radius, which is the length scale, P infinity, which is the surrounding fluid pressure, and rho L, which is the density of the surrounding fluid. So this can be thought of like an effective Reynolds number. And then another important scale is the non-dimensional material constant, which can be thought of as the rate at which viscosity undergoes transition scaled by the rate at which the bubble undergoes collapse. So it gives an idea of these two time scales basically. So what we are going to do is vary this effective viscosity at zero strain rate and effective viscosity at infinite strain rate by a factor of 10. So we are going to look at a shear thinning case in which the effective viscosity at zero strain rate is high, and the one at infinite rate is 1/10 of the one at zero strain rate. And inverting these two limits would give us a shear thickening case. So these viscosities are set, and that roughly determines the bubble characteristics. And the main idea would be to then change this material time constant, which is again the rate at which this the material viscosity changes. Okay, and we are going to explore this full range of Keru number, keeping this as our control parameter. Keru number is essentially the non-dimensional material constant, and also look at what happens to the bubble collapse characteristics as the standoff distance is varied. So now what we are going to see is that once the bubble sees this initial pressure change, in this case 20 times the ambient, what happens to its collapse characteristics as a function of its initial standoff and this change in the material constant. Okay. So for these particular simulations, we have used a reasonably large computational domain. This is to avoid any outflow boundary condition effects. So typically our bubble sits in a domain which looks somewhat like this. So bubble is out here. A zoomed in view of the bubble is shown here. So this is a bubble that has undergone collapse. And again, AMR helps us do a treatment in this manner in a computationally efficient way. So there are various levels of refinement, as you can see, and the bubble obviously sits in the maximum refinement region. So when we have a shear thinning case, the collapse looks somewhat like this. So out here, I'm showing you a bubble in gray, and the effective viscosity contours are shown through a color map like this. Blue effectively means low viscosity, whereas orange or red means high viscosity. So because the material constant here in this case is set to 1, you can see the viscosity changes that the fluid undergoes are not so significant. That means basically the material viscosity is on the higher side, and therefore there's no jet formation in this case. So the bubble simply grows and then collapses without undergoing a jetting collapse. When we increase this material constant to 5, you can see much more variations in the effective viscosity. Okay, and in this case, you can see a formation of a jet as well, right? And this jet goes and eventually impacts the surface out here. As we increase the material constant to even higher value, there's more dramatic changes in effective viscosity, and the jet speed is higher, as we'll find out. Okay. So if we quantify these jet speeds by looking at the velocity of this bubble wall along the symmetry axis, what we find is that during this growth phase, there's not so much of a difference that is induced by changes in this material constant, but during the collapse phase, there's a dramatic change. So when this material constant is large, one gets collapse, whereas when the material constant is close to 0, there's almost no jetting collapse. So there's over a 5-fold rheology induced variation in the jet speed that one observes. And the circles here indicate that this jet has actually undergone, this jet has made this distal side meet the proximal side of the bubble. That means the bubble has actually undergone a breakup. And one of key interest in these kind of things is basically the pressure that is observed at this wall. So if we look at what is the maximum pressure that the wall experiences, then it would look somewhat like this when the material constant is 0 or the effective viscosity of the fluid is the highest. And as one increases the material constant, one observes that there's increase in the pressures that the wall sees. So there's higher jet velocity and higher damage potential. So as you can see, there are two things here. One is the pressure that the wall sees, and when there's no jet, it's basically the bubble pressure that is seen by the wall. So there's this time scale of collapse, and there's this jetting time scale that is introduced. And as this jetting and collapse time scales merge, that's when the impact is the highest. Okay. If we go to a shear thickening case, an inverse trend is seen. So here we start off with low viscosities, something shown in blue. And then as the strain rate increases, one would start to see higher viscosities. Okay. So when the material constant is low, there are not so dramatic changes in the effective viscosity, and therefore the bubble jets. As the material constant is increased, there's more variations in the medium's effective viscosity, and one can see that this jetting is less intense. At even higher material constant, essentially one gets a complete suppression of this jetting behavior. Okay, so here, as you can see, there's no jet formation at all. So again, this can be quantified using the jet velocity, which is the velocity along the symmetry axis of this distal side of the bubble. So when there's no shear thickening, because the medium is at higher viscosity, there's no jetting at all. And then it's the other way around. When there's no shear thickening, you get a behavior like this, where you see jetting collapse due to low viscosity of the medium. And then as shear thickening kicks in, this jetting collapse is gradually suppressed. So same behavior can be observed for pressure as well. Essentially, with no shear thickening, you have higher pressures now. That is because the medium is at low viscosity and jet speeds are the highest. And as shear thickening is introduced, this jetting is suppressed, and one starts to get pretty much low pressures that the wall sees. So with different standoff distances, this very trend is repeated. So if you look at shear thinning cases, one observes that as the degree of shear thinning is increased, it promotes jetting, okay, at a standoff of 4.5. And as degree of shear thickening is increased, it suppresses jetting. Okay. And the same trend can be shown for other standoff distances as well. So if one summarizes all of this in terms of an effective bubble volume radius, or the effective bubble radius or the effective bubble volume, what one sees is that the bubble radius doesn't change so much as a function of these various shear thinning or shear thickening material parameters. So in more quantitative terms, if I just simply look at what's the maximum effective bubble radius and what's the minimum effective bubble radius, and plot it in terms of these material constants, I would see that there's less than or almost 10% change in the effective bubble radius, whether it's a maximum or a minimum. And the same holds for shear thickening and shear thinning cases. So throughout this collapse and jetting process, the bubble volume remains relatively insensitive to this material constant lambda bar. But obviously the jetting speeds are not. So if we look at shear thinning cases, one can come up with a regime map and summarize the observations as follows. Once we are below a certain material constant, there's actually no jet formation. Beyond a threshold material constant, for each of the standoffs, one starts to see a jet formation, but the jet is not strong enough to disintegrate the bubble. And beyond a higher threshold of material constant, shear thinning effects are strong, and therefore the jet basically disintegrates the bubble and then goes and impacts the wall. So jet impact is significant. For shear thickening case, it's the inverse trend. When we have a low degree of shear thickening, because the material's viscosity, effective viscosity is low, there's jet impact and there's high damage potential. Beyond a certain degree of shear thickening, the jet formation does take place, but the jet is not intense enough to disintegrate the bubble or cause a lot of damage. And when the degree of shear thickening is higher than this, then this red line here, then you have basically no jet formation at all. So the damage potential is quite low. So I will summarize the key findings here. From a rheological perspective, what I've basically shown is that even when the bubble volume is relatively insensitive to changes in the rheology, the jetting dynamics and peak stresses are. So that means that rheology can be fine-tuned in such a way that you separate the jetting time scales from the bubble collapse and growth time scales, all right, in such a way that damage is minimized or maximized. And from a methods perspective, I've shown to you a method for bubble dynamics, which unlike methods that are more tuned for wave dynamics, can account for these interfacial conditions in non-axisymmetric collapse simulations, basically. So there's potential for rheological inference. So if one thinks of an inverse problem where one wants to find out the rheology of a medium by simply looking at its bubble, by simply looking at how a bubble behaves, then one can look at jetting patterns and backtrack a rheological signature. And there's potential for protection as well. So by fine-tuning a medium's rheology, one can reduce these maximum jet speeds and peak stresses, basically. So gradually, we are moving at more and more complex bubble simulations. So one of the interests that we have is in basically quantifying the structural damage. So I'm just showing here a recent animation that we have been looking at. So here you essentially have a model of something like a turbine that rotates, and then there are these clusters of bubbles that sit around this turbine and cause localized damage as they undergo a jetting collapse. So much of this work has been possible because of support that we have received from the National Supercomputing Mission of India, and these simulations were performed on a local high performance computing machine that we have available to us. So development of the code and stuff basically was possible because of these open source libraries. So we have extensively used AMREX and Hyper in our computations. And I must also thank long-time collaborators, Professor Friend from UIUC. More recently, we've been collaborating with Pratik Das from IT Delhi, and also my students, Sundar Dasika, Mahesh Savadkar, and Deepak Boghani have contributed extensively to coming up with these simulation tools. And finally, Erskine program for putting me in the correct time zone for this talk. Yeah. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. It was very fascinating. I thought of a few questions during the talk, and then you answered it in the next slide. So it was very good in that sense. While we wait for questions from audience, I do have one question in mind that I was thinking about when you showed the last slide. In the previous simulations, when you were modeling the bubble hitting the wall, there's no effect from this velocity initially, am I right? But in the turbine case, we basically have a relative velocity between the bubble and the surface. How do you expect that this velocity affects it? Like, is there some sort of relationships between these relative velocities that impact the bubble behavior?
I think the relative. So once you have a structure that moves in a fluid, the effective the way it causes a change is that it makes the bubbles see this pressure perturbation that is induced because of the motion of the solid structure. But the jetting velocities themselves are pretty large, especially if the bubbles are located close to the solid surface. So For bubbles close to the vicinity of a surface, I think it's the jetting speed that primarily matters. But if they sit sufficiently far away from a solid, then yeah, their collapse intensity could be high, but it won't impact the solid surface as much. I think, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience? Please feel free to speak up or type in the chat. May I just ask one other question? For the
Sure.
2D simulations, I felt like this should be not computationally expensive, because you mentioned for the multiple clusters that this would be then very computationally expensive. But how's it for the single bubbles? How long does it usually take if you're running one simulation for these cases, for example?
So I think so if you look at it depends on actually what really is of interest here. So if you only are interested in perhaps the jetting characteristics, so formation of a jet as the bubble undergoes collapse, these also tend to be pretty high Reynolds number and Weber number cases, because you can see it's an intense jet, that even though it is at a micro scale, right? So from that perspective, it's not as computationally it is computationally expensive, because you are resolving something that has a length scale that is much smaller than the scale of the bubble, right? And once the splash does occur, so then once this jet goes and hits the wall, and then if one is interested in what happens to the bubble afterwards, then it's more challenging, because you have formation of these small structures that would essentially be caused because of the jet impinging on the wall and then leading to these finer scale structures. So, well, yeah.
That's right. Thank you. Any other questions from anyone online? I guess then we thank you for your talk. We did have a clap from the audience, I saw at some point, so I guess no other questions.
Yeah.
And another clap, I can see now. Thank you for the talk. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and have a good rest of the day.
Yeah, thanks.